Well, good morning, church.
Morning.
Good morning.
All the church in here, out there, whether you're experiencing this in real time or watching it later, we're glad you're joining us today. Happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day.
I want to introduce you this morning to someone many of you may already know. We encountered her, in fact, just a few moments ago in our scripture reading. An excellent wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. That's Proverbs 31:10. The beginning of that extended passage describing this amazing woman. We sometimes refer to her, in fact, as the Proverbs 31 woman. And now that's interesting. We call her that because she is unnamed. And you'd think someone as impressive as this lady would be named, and no name. That irritates people sometimes. Why doesn't this woman have a name? I mean, you know, a lot of times in the Bible when a character goes unnamed, that's a way of symbolizing that that character is someone in a powerless position, a lowly position. The shepherds, for instance, in the New Testament, the story of the birth of Jesus, Luke just says, there were shepherds out in the field, and no names. They're the nameless, powerless ones. That's the point of their presence in the story. Jesus comes to and for the powerless ones. Same in the Old Testament with the little Israelite servant girl. In 2 Kings 5, in the story of Naaman the leper. Do you remember that? Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria. He's a leper, but he gets a name in the text. Little girl, no name. She's one of those without power. And yet her advice to Naaman changes his life forever. That's the point of the story. Even the very powerless can make a difference if they know the power of the God of Israel. So sometimes, when a character doesn't get a name, it's a way of saying this character is without influence or agency in the world, deprived of even a name. But don't think that here. I mean, this woman, the Proverbs 31 woman, she is not without power and agency. And you'd know that if you were listening when we read about her just now. Verse 16, she considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She has her own money that she earned, that she has control over, which is unusual for a married woman in this context. I mean, remember, this is the Middle East in the Bronze Age, right? 3,000 years or so, or thereabouts, 3,000 years ago, or thereabouts. Most husbands in that culture didn't trust their wives with control of finances. But notice she also purchases and owns real estate, which is likewise unusual. And in verse 18, she perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. And in verse 24, she makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchants. She owns her own business, which is really unusual for that day and time. But still, no name. Now, there have been those who have tried to give her a name because they feel like she should have a name. And I understand, if nothing else, it's inconvenient to be always referring to her as the Proverbs 31 woman. So some have noted that the old King James translation that I read in my youth, some of you did too, the King James has there in verse 10, instead of she is far more precious than jewels, which is our English Standard Version, it has, King James, her price is far above rubies. So they've said, we should call her Ruby, which is fine. That's a fine name for her, I guess. Although others have justly noted that we don't really know what kind of jewel or gemstone it's talking about there in the text. We remember, of course, that this wasn't originally composed in English. It was composed in Hebrew. We read it in translation, and this is the problem that we have with translating ancient documents. We aren't always sure about the names of specialty items like gemstones. The Hebrew word that's translated here as some kind of gemstone is panim, which you can say with me if you like. Panim. We're going to be doing a lot of Hebrew this morning. And we do know from the way it's used elsewhere that a panim is some kind of a reddish gem, red or pink. So some scholars have thought maybe a pink pearl. We know those were fashionable in that part of the world at the time. So some have said, let's call her Pearl. And that's fine too. And other scholars have opined that perhaps a panine is a garnet. So ruby, pearl, garnet, whatever you want to call her. But I want to talk about her this morning. The Proverbs 31 woman. Because it's Mother's Day, so it seemed appropriate. And in the text, she is nameless. But understand, the purpose of her namelessness is not to take her down a peg in our estimation, not to comment on her influence and agency or lack thereof. In this context, her namelessness is not because she's powerless, it's because she's imaginary. And I need you to get this. The Proverbs 31 woman is not an actual person. And I don't know if this was you when you were a kid, but when I was a kid, I had an imaginary friend. I thought that was something you were supposed to do. I thought every kid was supposed to make up an imaginary friend, and so I did. I had an imaginary friend who was a little girl named Lisa. I don't know why my imaginary friend was a girl named Lisa, but she was. But if you listen to women talk about the Proverbs 31 woman, for a lot of them, what she is more like an imaginary nemesis. Because there's no measuring up to her. You can't measure up to the Proverbs 31 woman. You read about her, and she's the perfect wife, the perfect mom. She cooks, she cleans, she sews, she supports her very successful husband in his very successful career. She gets up early, she stays up late, and her kids are perfect, and they love her. But not only that, she's an ornament to her community. Involved in charity work, owns her own business, like we said. She has success inside the home and out. She can bring home the bacon and fry it up in the pan, except she's Jewish, so she doesn't eat pork, so no. But I need you to understand that there is no historical woman behind the Proverbs 31 woman. She never existed. She is, in fact, proverbial. That's what she's doing in the book of Proverbs. In fact, what she is poetic. If you were with us virtually 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, in fact, we talked about this particular kind of poetry. If you look at the description, the Proverbs 31 woman, Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, what you may notice is that it's 22 verses. And anytime anything in the Old Testament is 22 verses long or some multiple thereof, you should pay special attention because that means that probably the Hebrew alphabet is involved. The Hebrew alphabet, you may remember, is 22 letters long. And a thing that Hebrew poets like to do was line up all 22 letters, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, so forth down the line to all along the edge of the page, remembering that Hebrew reads from right to left, the opposite of how we do. And then you would write a poem where each next line starts with a word that starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. 3 weeks ago, we talked about Psalm 111. And then 2 weeks ago, Psalm 112, and they were both this. We call poems of this sort alphabetic acrostics. That's the name for this sort of poetry, alphabetic acrostic. In Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, all about the wonderful woman. It's also an alphabetic acrostic. It's a poem. And the idea of alphabetic acrostic poetry, you may remember, is I'm going to cover this subject, as we would say, from A to Z. Only for them it was Aleph to Tav. It's a thorough, elaborate exploration of the idea. So here, it's a thorough, elaborate exploration of the idea of the perfect woman. But it's an idea. It's not an actual person. And we might have known this if we were paying attention from the very beginning, because how does the description start? An excellent wife, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. And that question there at the beginning, it's a rhetorical question. We talked a bit last week about rhetorical questions when we were looking at Psalm 113. And you may remember in that psalm the question, who is like the Lord our God? Who is seated on high, who looks far down on the heavens and the earth. And you're not meant to try to sit there and figure out an answer. Who is like the Lord our God? It's not a riddle. The answer is nobody. Nobody is like the Lord our God. So here, an excellent wife, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. It's not like we're supposed to figure it out. Who can find an excellent wife? Well, I bet shimmying down the street, he's always been good at meeting girls. No, the answer is no one. It's like Jesse's girl. Where can I find a woman like that? Nowhere. But now, while I'm at it, I need just momentarily to take issue with the translation. Because the English Standard Version, which we're using this morning, which I normally favor, translates this, an excellent wife. And that's not a great translation. Because first of all, it makes a false distinction. See, the phrase is an eshet chavil. Told you we'd be doing a bit of Hebrew this morning. You can say that if you like. Eshet chavil. You have to get the in there. It's a throat-clearing word. Eshet chavil. But see, eshet is just the word woman. Now, yes, as you read the rest of the poem, the woman in question, Ruby Pearl Garnet, she does happen to be married. But Hebrew doesn't have a specific word, wife, meaning a married woman. Hebrew can't make that distinction. So the translation, wife, is unjustifiably narrow. In fact, if you read the book of Ruth, the only other place outside of Proverbs where this phrase is used, we find Boaz using this exact phrase when he says to Ruth, all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. He says, they all know that you are an eshet chavil. And at the time he's saying this, chapter 3, Ruth is unmarried. Nobody's wife. She's a widow. So that's better. We could say a worthy woman who can find. That way, it's not just, by the way, wives who have to deal with the imaginary nemesis of Proverbs 31. Women, it's all persons of the female sort. But also, while I'm here, that word chavil. Take issue with the translation because excellent, worthy even, they don't totally get at the feel of the word, the sense of it. It's an interesting word. It's got kind of a hard edge to it, like a kind of gleam or glow. It can be used as a noun, and when it is, if it names a collection of inanimate objects, like things you might own, then chayil is wealth. If it names a group of armed men, then chayil is an army. That's weird. But on the other hand, when it's used as it is in our text as an adjective, if it's a horse, a chayil horse is a strong horse. When a man is described as chayil, if he's a leader, he's able or active. If he's a soldier and he's chayil, he's valiant or brave. It's one of those words that seems to mean kind of everything and nothing, but you know it when you see it. So the Proverbs 31 woman is an eshet chayil, a woman of, what shall we say? Strength, valor, ability, quality. King James Version says a virtuous woman. And maybe that can't actually be improved on. Whatever she has going on, it's good stuff. But you have to understand right up front that no actual flesh and blood woman can live up to this. And I have to say, I'm tired of preachers who act like they can. Now, manifestly, I'm not a woman, but I have read the experiences of women who have written of their struggles with the Proverb 31 woman. More than one woman has written about how it felt like their preacher was preaching the Proverbs 31 woman every year for Mother's Day. I read one woman who said, I started staying home from church on Mother's Day because of it, to avoid the Proverbs 31 woman. And I get it, because she's intimidating. So hear me when I say this. The Proverbs 31 woman is completely imaginary. But now an interesting question that we might want to ask is, who imagined her? And of course, the sort of short, perfunctory answer that a lot of women might be tempted to respond with is, well, obviously some man. Because of course, that's the narrative that we've been sold, that the whole Bible was written by men. So they think some man dreamed her up, and then it ended up in the Bible, so religious leaders could give all the women in their congregations an inferiority complex. And I mean, fair enough, although I would argue that the Proverbs 31 woman would give most men an inferiority complex. Yes. I mean, I do know what men are like, and I can tell you most men, confronted by a woman with this level of energy and ability and accomplishment and intellect, they don't think that's the girl for me. They think, how can I keep her from taking my job? So that does not seem to hold water. Most men, left to their own devices, allowed to compose a poem about their perfect woman, would compose something more along the lines of one contemporary poetic mastermind who said, a girl that's nice, a girl that's not obsessed with her looks but is insanely hot, the kind of girl you can show to your folks, loves the movies you like, and always laughs at your jokes. Some of you are like, I want to meet that girl. You lower your expectations. If you don't know what I'm talking about, ask a millennial, they know. But if I may direct your attention to the beginning of the chapter, the first verse of chapter 31 tells us who came up with this poem. It says, the words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. Now let me say up front that there have been in the past commentators who are uncomfortable with this, because we don't know for sure who King Lemuel was, we don't know who his mother was, and so they try to minimize her. That makes sense, doesn't it? And they say, well, okay, maybe she taught him the first 9 verses of this chapter, and it's very practical advice. It's about being a good king and not getting caught up in partying and realizing that as a king you have responsibilities that regular people don't have. But just those 9 verses, that's all. And I just want to say, have you met Jewish mothers? Have you not at the very least heard jokes about typical Jewish mothers? You think they're going to stop at 9 verses? And it seems like what Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31 actually is a handbook for young men composed by a mom saying, when you go to look for a wife, this is what A to Z to keep in mind. And I think that makes more sense. I think Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31, sounds like that. By the way, for all we know to the contrary, realize this is just my personal headcanon, and it is in no way likely, but for all we know, King Lemuel's mother may in fact be the author also of Psalms 111 and 112. They also are anonymous, may have been written by a woman. Maybe she specialized in alphabetic acrostics. We don't know. But if you read the Proverbs 31 woman poem as that, as advice from a mom to her son, it begins to make a lot more sense. Son, find this kind of woman. I love especially verse 30. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Glory. No man wrote that. That's not the sort of thing most men would write. But what the poet is saying is, son, look, a woman who charms you, let's just makeup and perfume and fancy clothes, and her giggling at your jokes, and they really aren't that funny. She's probably just pretending to like sports also. And also, son, listen. Physical beauty is transitory. That's what vain means. We all get old. And also, you're not nearly as good looking as you think you are. The real thing, the lasting thing, the thing that really matters when she's not wearing makeup and she's tired of your stories, the thing that will really matter is, does she fear the Lord? Because a woman who fears the Lord, understand, that's a woman whose character has been shaped by the character of the Lord. Amen. And in this sense, by the way, I just have to say, it's not that the Proverbs 31 woman isn't real. Just because she's proverbial and poetical and imaginary doesn't mean she's not real. She is, in fact, very real. She's real in the same way numbers are real. You think about how we get numbers, right? You have 2 sheep, or 2 melons, or 2 coins, or 2 wombats, or whatever you have. And eventually, after you do that enough times, you get the idea of 2. And 2 is real. You can't point to it. You can't weigh it. But that's what numbers are like. You can understand them. They're almost more real than the things they describe. They're like hyper real. And the Proverbs 31 woman is hyper real. Because what she is the aggregate of everything that happens when women fear the Lord. That's what's really going on in this poem after all. Because it's not her accomplishments that matter. It's not her vineyard or her sashes that matter. It's her character. What's she like? I mean, if this were an hour-long study, we could just walk up and down in this poem and unravel every particular. But just in brief, the heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. What does it mean? Well, like God, whose character has shaped her character, she's faithful and trustworthy. That's her character. She seeks to do good for those she loves, and that's her character. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She's like the ships of the merchants. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. And again, it's not about her recipes. It's not about that she knows where the good spices are. It's about her character. What's going on in there? Well, she's careful in her work and caring for her people. That's what makes her a woman who fears the Lord. And off it goes. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hand to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. Now, I don't know if my wife even knows where her distaff is at this point. And if her lamp does not go out at night, it's probably because she's watching a TV show or doing her Duolingo. But that brings me to an important point. Because I'm also tired of preachers who get in the pulpit and act like their wife is the Proverbs 31 woman. She's not. They aren't. And that's too much pressure to put on preachers' wives. It's too much pressure to put on anyone. The point is, though, that this woman has the benefit of her people in mind, and it doesn't matter to her if she has to do some weight-bearing exercise in the process. What's her character? She makes the most of her time. She pays attention to what she's doing. She opens her hand to the poor, reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. What's her character? She has care beyond her family. She looks to the poor and tries to take care of them. What's her character? She provides. Now, is the color of the clothing important? Well, no. I mean, red clothes have meant different things at different times. Although people, by the way, at this point have tried especially to make spiritual application. And there maybe is something to be said about a Christian woman who makes certain in hard times that her husband and children are covered in the blood of Jesus. I don't know. I don't know, but this may be one of the places where the picture of the individual woman begins to merge with that of the church, with that of wisdom itself, with that of the Holy Spirit. But if that is so, if the picture here begins to go beyond the individual woman, if it's a picture also of the church, then it's the church as she strives to be and not as she so often is. And that's, again, the point for women in general. This is the godly woman as she strives to be, not as she often is. And again, I could run through the whole thing, but the particulars are not the point. The point is the character. And we might have known that back at the beginning. Remember how I was talking about Boaz and Ruth? And he said, all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And it's the same phrase. Well, when he said that, not only was she not married, she didn't have any children. She didn't have a business. She didn't have a field. She didn't have anyone but her likewise widowed mother-in-law. Nothing in the world of her own, but she was taking care of what she had, of who she had. And she was faithful, and she was diligent, and she was caring, and most of all, she feared the Lord. And Boaz said, that's a worthy woman. It was. That's a woman who is to be praised.